I mean, like, look at Into the Pit. Eleanor came to the games, she's real, and she's very powerful.
Ladies, gentlemen, and those with the good sense to do away with the whole notion, I welcome you to the premier audio medium for all your Fazbear entertainment needs, the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. Note, FFPP is not responsible for any loss of appetite, disinterest, dismemberment, or other legally classified statuses. So strap in and enjoy.
Welcome back to the Freddy Fazbear Podcast. I'm your host with the toast, Rye Toast, here to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's. Mark will be joining us until some point because he really wanted attention. But today we're talking about, I guess, kind of a controversial topic. A lot of fans for a long time. How do I even broach this topic? I have some notes, but I didn't really write down a good intro for it. The main question we're going to be tackling is what parts of the franchise can be considered for the main timeline of Five Nights at Freddy's. And just at the jump, before, like traditionally, I would say, for the past 10 years almost, most people, especially most of the more casual fan base, just assumed that the mainline games were part of the main timeline continuity and that the books were just there for side stories that really didn't affect much. But, you know, there were always divides and splits within the fandom. I think the main four, like, parts of the fandom were what I just described, where the mainline games are all that matters and all that is looked into. And then there was Stitchline, where, well, let's getting ahead of ourselves. There was Frights games, where all of Fazbear Frights were within the game's timeline. And that was more of a controversial opinion. The more palatable one that people often went with was Stitchline, that being the Stitch Wraith stingers, or the epilogues of Fazbear Frights, and their associated stories are what appear in the main game timeline, and the other side stories are just extra content. The main reason for that is that in some of these Stitch Wraith in some of the Fazbear Fright stories, like, end of the world shit happens, and it very clearly could not happen within the main game's timeline. So it's kind of the way to get around that, because realistically, the epilogues do draw on a good chunk of the, like, main stories of Fazbear Frights, but not all of them, and luckily, not any of the ones that would seriously damage the world. And then more recently, there's TalesGames, where that part of the fandom believes that the Tales from the Pizzaplex books are within the major games timeline, and they're giving us more of a look into the Pizzaplex and other Pizzaplexes throughout the country. So that was kind of like the main, I guess, like, chunk of the fandom, was those four different ways of looking at the games and the associated mediums, and I honestly believe the majority of the fan base kind of disregarded the books, for better or for worse. I do believe, just from what I see in comment sections and online off of places like Twitter and Reddit, I feel like most of the more casual parts of the fandom completely disregard the books, which I think you're welcome to do. I think in 1 month, everything has changed drastically, because within this past month, arguably within the past 3 weeks, we got Into the Pit, a major FNAF game directly based off of one of the Fazbear Frights stories. We got VIP, the beginning to a brand new interactive novel series, said book incredibly closely tying Tales from the Pizzaplex to Security Breach. We got an interview with Scott and Doggo, where Scott mentioned that because he was so secretive with Steel Wool, the story of Security Breach is not the story that he intended, and that it shipped without his, like, what he exactly wanted the story to be, and they've had to since course correct, which they have. I assume the direct statements end there, but I assume by course correct he means with Ruin, with Help Wanted 2, even with the books. And then Five Laps at Freddy's, ostensibly a spinoff, has major lore repercussions in it. So can we, like, take that as, because previously all the spin-off games for FNAF were very clearly not in continuity. They were drastically different. They were made almost solely by Scott and had jokes thrown throughout it and references for the franchise. Like, they were a love letter to the fandom, but they were clearly not meant to be taken as part of the timeline. So what about Five Laps at Freddy's? at the jump, before we get like too deep into this discussion, because it will be a big discussion, I want to make something exceedingly clear. I'm not going to remember to say I think or I feel before every single sentence of this discussion. So I just want to say it once at the top super clearly. All of this is my opinion. I do not know for certain what parts of this franchise are within the continuity of its main timeline or not. Nobody does. That's part of the joy and fun of digging into this franchise. You don't even know what you're working with until you're working with it. So I want to be incredibly clear. I'm going to probably make some statements that sound like I'm saying them as fact. None of this is fact. It is all my opinion. If I say something later on like, Into the Pit shows us that XYZ is true, that is my opinion. All right, do not take any of these clips and be like, oh, Raito said this is a fact. No, I did not. All of this is my opinion. It is up for interpretation, if you will. Oh, you already done? He's already done, and he left so much fur on me. So I guess we should start with kind of my most recent personal revelation and also one of the quicker bits of this conversation. And that's TalesGames. For a long time, I was against Tales from the Pizzaplex being within the game's timeline, and it was mainly because it didn't line up really well with Burn Trap, with where the Mimic ends up, and I thought, and I do still think, Edwin is a narrative parallel for Henry. Whether or not they are two separate characters, I do think they are still a narrative parallel, regardless. And I really want to be clear here, because the word parallel has been poisoned. Just because something is a narrative parallel, that does not mean it's a replacement for that parallel. It can be. It totally can be. But things can parallel them, like two things within the same story can be parallels of each other and still separately exist. So don't think when I say that I'm directly implying something. I just mean they narratively reflect each other, regardless. And I was pretty in that boat for a while until VIP and the Scott Cawthon interview came out like 3 weeks ago. And now I kind of lean the opposite. The fact that Security Breach, so for those of you who didn't watch the doco interview, you should, but in it, Scott says that Security Breach's story was mishandled by him. Essentially, he was so understandably afraid to share the story of these games, and specifically the story of Security Breach, with Steel Wool, that he never actually told them what the story was meant to be. He more so oversaw their development and told them to put things in specific places and do things in a specific way. And his hope was that he would leave breadcrumbs in the game like he always does, and the fans would piece them together. He failed to realize that when you don't tell a development team the story of your game, the story they put in there isn't going to be the story you intended for it to be. So all the pieces are there, but they were placed in a way that Scott did not want them to be originally. And then that they've since had to course correct. And in my mind, I was like, okay, what has come out after Security Breach? Ruin, Tales from the Pizzaplex, and Help Wanted 2. All three things are pretty different from Security Breach in one way or another. This is the course correction. VIP already had me on like a seesaw where I was like, VIP very much, I think, is talking to us about the Security Breach Pizzaplex, but it makes a lot of references to the Tales from the Pizzaplex version of the same building, and it keeps mentioning that the place is about to go under a major renovation. So I'm like, okay, maybe this is how they're going to tie Tales from the Pizzaplex directly to Security Breach. I could see that, but I'm still on the fence. And then I heard what Scott said in the interview, and I'm like, oh, okay, maybe Tales from the Pizzaplex is just in continuity, which, like, I guess so. It's one of those things where when you look at Tales from the Pizzaplex, in putting it into most FNAF timelines doesn't change a lot. It just gives you a lot of extra information around Security Breach. The only major changes that inputting Tales in the Pizzaplex would make is the Mimic's origin. Now, granted, right now in the games, we do not have a direct explanation or evidence for the Mimic's origins. We can only speculate. So, I think a big turning point for a lot of people, myself included, will be the next two releases that have to do with this era. That being the interactive novel Escape the Pizzaplex, where we're playing as Cassie, the main character from Ruin, and Secret of the Mimic. If these two things lean towards Tales in the Pizzaplex, I think it's an open and shut case. But if Escape the Pizzaplex doesn't really lean either way, and then if Secret of the Mimic comes out and it gives us an origin that is different from the Mimic from Tales in the Pizzaplex, then TalesGames is dead in the water, I think. So, as I would say, VIP and the Scott interview made me lean towards and agree with, for now, the idea that Tales in the Pizzaplex stories exist within the game's timeline. And they give us more information on the Mimic and how it was created and how it arrived at the Pizzaplex. The make it or break it moment will be next year with Escape the Pizzaplex and then Secret of the Mimic. If they don't really give us any information either way, then I'm probably just going to stick with TalesGames. But if it gives more evidence for TalesGames, I'm going to be more solid in that opinion. If it goes against TalesGames, then I'll probably go back to believing that they are spin-off stories that do not take place in the game's timeline, like the Silver Eyes, which Scott directly stated the Silver Eyes do not exist within the game's timeline. They don't fit together like puzzle pieces. So that's Tales in the Pizzaplex. Another somewhat shorter one. I mean, it's not short, but like it's shorter than the next topic anyway. 5 Laps at Freddy's. It's a weird one because the Steam page of 5 Laps at Freddy's presents itself as an in-universe game. And I think for the most part, that made sense. If the full game only had references to FNAF 1 through Help Wanted, I would be okay with signing off that 5 Laps at Freddy's is an in-universe FNAF game. Like it literally exists within the FNAF universe, created by Fazbear as another way to make fun of its past. I'd be totally fine with that. I'd sign off on that and be like, okay, that makes total sense. My hang-up is with the sinkhole. The third level of the demo is literally us driving through the sinkhole under the security breach Pizzaplex. That sinkhole is only known by 3 living people, and 2 of them are confirmed to not be dead. The third one might be dead, right? Because we have 4 people. Because we have Gregory, who in one of the endings can visit the sinkhole, and according to Ruin, knows about the sinkhole. Vanessa, who, we all know Vanessa. She literally slept in a vanny den down there, most likely. Cassie, who doesn't have an ending where she comes back from the sinkhole, and Cassie's dad, who, if he is the protagonist of Help Wanted 2, is dead. So, if only 2 confirmed alive people know about the sinkhole, how the fuck is it in 5 Laps at Freddy's as an in-universe FNAF game presented by Fazbear? It doesn't make sense. So, the presence of the sinkhole to me says this game is fully not in continuity, right? This game makes the most sense being outside of the continuity. And it's just a fun spin-off game with references throughout the franchise for the fandom to play and enjoy. And I'm totally fine with that, and I think that's great. So, the big question, if it's not an in-continuity game, can we trust anything that it presents to us? In the final release of the game, I think so. But only direct references, very on-the-top evidence. Should we be looking through 5 Laps at Freddy's and different combinations to get any scrounge of information of like, oh, in this one level, in the very back, there's a puppet poster in this restaurant where there wasn't one. So that means probably not. But things like Midnight Motor as a map existing and showing us the mound as this big, long rectangle, not just a mound of dirt. And it is important. That's probably worth mentioning. And you know what? Something I've neglected to do, and I really ought to. I should see if there's the windmill or the water tower in Midnight Motor, because that would really bolster my theory on Fallfest taking place in that same clearing. But I kind of forgot to look, so I don't know. Or, for example, again with Midnight Motorist, the Midnight Motorer having a Spring Bonnie antenna topper. Because yes, this is a spin-off game made by Click Team. It's not even made by Scott Cawthon. But it is an official FNAF game being promoted by Scott Cawthon himself. If there was something obvious in this game that he did not want in it, it wouldn't be there. End of story, period, full stop. Right? Like, I've seen people dismiss any of the lore of Five Laps at Freddy's because Click Team made a post earlier saying, we need more Unity developers. If you're a FNAF fan, apply. And people said they hired FNAF fans to make this game, so we can't trust it. That's really... What's the word I want to look... The word I want... To me, that's a really unfair interpretation of this tweet. To say that we need Unity devs, apply if you're a FNAF fan, means they had to hire FNAF fans because they don't know what they're doing, is not only unfair, but really just rude, and just why do you talk to people that way? That just seems really mean. And also not true. Because what I read that tweet as is, we're looking for Unity developers to help us make this FNAF game. And if you're a FNAF fan, this would be a great opportunity for you to join our team. They want people excited about the project. They're still working for Scott Cawthon. Like, it's still an official game. So even, it's like the Silver Eyes, right? The Silver Eyes is primarily written by another person. Does that mean we cannot use anything that it presents because it's primarily written by another person? He hired a FNAF fan to write this book. Why the fuck would we read it? Like, that's what you sound like. And you're also discrediting the people that work very hard on these things. So, to all the people who said something like this, I think that's incredibly rude, and it's not true. Regardless, for Five Laps at Freddy's, I'm going to treat it similarly as I would the Silver Eyes, where I look at this game. Did this game happen in the timeline? No. Does this game exist in the timeline? Probably not. But are there major things from this game that we can probably take into consideration? I think so. I think that's a reasonable assessment of a game like Five Laps at Freddy's. So now is the big one. So if a little peek behind the curtain. I take notes before the podcast to keep me on track. And everything I've talked to up until now is about half a page of notes. This next one is a page and a half. Into the Pit. Is Into the Pit part of the main timeline? And if so, what does that change? It's a big question to tackle. On the surface, I've seen a lot of people say there are so many Easter eggs in this game, it is impossible to sift what is a purposeful reference and what is an Easter egg, so all of it should be taken lightly and not be taken as an in-universe game or an in-universe event. I think that's slightly unfair. Are there Easter eggs referencing the entire franchise, even ones that make no in-game sense? Yes. But that's not new. Security Breach has arcade machines that not only reference previous games, which you can explain with Help Wanted, but it has a couple machines that refer to fanverse games, or like the fact that the Desolate Hope coffee maker can appear in FNAF World, which is a important game to the there have always been and will always be Easter eggs that don't make any sense. So just because there's a lot of them, I don't think necessitates this game is outside of the continuity. I think that's fine, especially if here's what I essentially am doing with Into the Pit. I look at it, and if an Easter egg makes no fucking sense, or is like a little blipper and you might miss it, for the most part, I'm going to ignore it. And I'm going to be like, oh, that's a cool Easter egg. This is an anniversary game, and move past it. That's how I'm looking at Into the Pit right now. So as far as the game itself, it is a direct recreation of one of Fazbear Frights' stories with very strong references to other Fazbear Frights stories, to the point that, look at Into the Pit. Eleanor came to the games, she's real, and she's very powerful. So, to say, and this also goes back to the Easter eggs, to say that none of this can be taken, we can't tell what's important and what's not, when one of the Easter eggs is the poster in Oswald's room will sometimes turn into the Twisted Ones cover. That's cool. That's an Easter egg. Meanwhile, there are 3 mini games that you have to specifically access by doing secret tasks, which will unlock a 3rd ending. That seems meaningful. So I believe that Into the Pit, as a meaningful game, is Fazbear Frights. It is Fazbear's Frights. So the question then becomes, is Into the Pit a main Five Nights at Freddy's game in the continuity of the Five Nights at Freddy's timeline? I don't see a reason to say no. So I'm not going to. I'm going to say yes, it is. And then the second question that immediately comes to mind are the Frights books and their associated stories in the main timeline of Five Nights at Freddy's. Last month, I would have still said no, because I had one major stipulation for the Fazbear Frights stories being in the game's timeline, and that was Burn Trap. Because I believed, from what Security Breach gave us, Burn Trap is William Afton's corpse. It makes the most sense. It's a very clean-cut answer. There's a William Afton body inside a horribly damaged Spring Bonnie suit that goes under a fire. And then, in the next game, we see a burnt Bonnie suit with the remains of a man inside of it. That's a really direct connection. So I was all against Fazbear Frights being anywhere near the game's timeline, because in Fazbear Frights, William Afton's body literally explodes, and his agony infects multiple objects. Those are the objects that make up the stories that lead into the epilogues of Fazbear Frights. So his body literally explodes, they recollect the pieces, he forms into a trash monster, gets stabbed with a forklift, the puppet mask gets placed on him, and then he gets torn apart. He tears himself apart when the puppet mask starts taking over, and he dissolves into a lake. Not dissolves, but he sinks into a lake. William Afton is super beyond mega infinity dead halfway through the Fazbear Frights epilogues, essentially. So if his body was intact in Security Breach, Fazbear Frights could not, under any circumstances, be in the game's timeline. Is what I believed a month ago. But then Scott said what he said about Burn Trap. And to me, in that interview, Scott said, I'm getting ahead of myself. In that interview, Scott said that Burn Trap was never supposed to move. He was supposed to be something you see in the background, out of the corner of your eye, behind a machinery, just for a moment, and then he's gone. You weren't even really sure if he was there. And to me, that sounds like he's a hallucination, possibly a digital hallucination being induced by the Mimic One program, since Gregory's trying to break free of it. Kind of like a whip to the victim of get back in line. So and then we see in the course correction post Security Breach in Ruin, the charging pod that Burn Trap comes out of is empty. In Tales from the Pizzaplex, we get stories, but we never get one mention of Burn Trap. In Help Wanted 2, we see Glitch Trap emerge from a charging pod, but no mention or showcase of Burn Trap. Burn Trap does not exist outside of Security Breach, except for one comic where Gregory draws what he looks like. The one kid who would have seen him in his vision. To be fair, I'm still confused on what the Tangle is, because Burn Trap seems to not be real. But the Tangle appears again in Ruin before Cassie puts on the mask, which to me says it's definitely real, which is interesting. Regardless, if Burn Trap is not a real thing, but instead a hallucination, I suddenly no longer have a stipulation against at least Stitchline being in the game's timeline. Because after all, realistically, again, there are some certain Fazbear Frights books like Sea Bonnies where the world would end, essentially. But for the Stitch line, like the Stitch line referring to the Stitch Wraith Stingers, again, the epilogues and their associated stories, if you add those stories and the epilogues to any FNAF timeline, all that it does is begin after Ultimate Custom Night and make sure that William is super mega dead, clearing the way for Help Wanted and the Mimic and all of this to take place. So it really doesn't mess with the rest of the timeline in a super meaningful way. So in my opinion, until proven otherwise, the Mega Cat Studios Fazbear Frights stories are in timeline, for me anyway, in implying that the rest of the Fazbear Frights stories are also similarly within the game's timeline. Now, I assume there will be changes. After all, there were many changes made to Into the Pit, but this main story is still the same. They've just been tweaked. So for now, I'll probably use the Fazbear Frights stories and their overarching plots in crafting a timeline. But when those respective games come out, whenever they do, if there are any major changes, then I'll add them to the timeline. You know, I don't think any FNAF timeline is ever set in stone. They are living beings. Honestly, all theories are these living, breathing organisms that change and grow as we do. So, yeah. I still, however, do not owe any of you motherfuckers a Stan is Wrong song. I've said this before, and I'll say it again here clearly so you can clip this. I've said before, people have misinterpreted me to say that if I ever believed that Tales or Frights were in the games, I would have to do the Stan is Wrong song. That is not what I said. I've said if a name like Edwin or David ever meaningfully appear about the Mimic in-game, I will do the Stan is Wrong song. Secret of the Mimic, that's your best shot. So if Secret of the Mimic, the name Edwin or David, come up meaningfully about the Mimic, I will do the Stan is Wrong song. That's a promise. Scout's honor. I was a Boy Scout for 2 years, I think. I made a race car. It was kind of fun, I guess. I'm not even a boy anymore. But yeah, essentially, within 1 month, the vast amount of releases we got for the anniversary took me from a games-only believer to a Tales Stitchline believer. So rejoice in the comments, I guess. Y'all won. But before we move on, something super important that I did not get to talk about yet on this podcast, the plushie. I'm making a plushie for a toast. I think now it might be the good time to talk about this because I wanted to really expand on my thoughts. But if I made an ad that was 5 minutes long for a plushie you couldn't even buy yet, I think I would have been murdered, and justly so. So I'm going to gush now. For a while, I had been of two minds where I've wanted to kind of collect rye toast behind a mascot that is not myself. But I don't want to stop doing face cam. Or I don't want to stop recording. I like the face-to-face nature of this. I like you guys being able to see my cats and things like that. So I wasn't really sure how to go about it, you know? Like, do the streams turn into, like, VTubing streams, essentially? Maybe, not. Maybe not. And I don't want to switch to PNG tubing for main channel videos, because that'd be a really drastic change, and not everyone would like that. But I have a second channel, and hopefully within a month or two, I'll start putting up videos on there. I don't really have a super strict deadline, but I did want to try out essentially PNG tubing, as it were. And I think I'm going to do that on the second channel. So keep an eye out for that. But then the question is, okay, if I'm collecting this brand, this channel, this identity behind a mascot, who is it? It's a creature you've all known very well, Toast. I'll put this GIF in the corner, if I remember, hopefully, to kind of sum up this little gremlin. But you've seen them on some thumbnails on the main channel, but mostly on the second channel, where they kept just getting into trouble, which would relate to that gameplay video essentially. But I kind of really like this little character, and it's super simple, right? It's a piece of bread with a face and limbs. I'm not treading any untread ground here, but I love the idea of this little gremlin who is incredibly gullible, is incredibly naive, and also a coward. So they end up in these terrifying life or death situations like all the horror games that I play, but it's not because they're trying to save the day. They just didn't know any better and they wandered in, and now they got to get themselves out. I just love that idea. And when it comes to like thinking about them as a character, I think of another big part of the reason why I wanted to officially make Toast this mascot of this channel is also for like fan art. I love all of like, I still have saved, and I've printed it out, but I keep meaning to frame it. The first ever fan art I received, and it meant so much to me. And fan art in general is an insane concept that someone would take time out of their day to use their talents and their gifts and their skills to just give a nice present to a stranger online. And I've heard more than a couple people being like, yeah, I'd love to make fan art for the channel, but I don't want to draw a person. And I'm like, that's so valid. Because I've tried to learn art, like specifically illustration in the past, and I want to do more. I just don't have a lot of time right now. And people were always, I love drawing landscapes and painting landscapes, but I could never put people in them. People were always the thing I hated drawing. And I totally get that for fan artists out there. So I'm also kind of maybe a little selfishly hoping that if I kind of showcase Toast as the true mascot of these channels, just do fan art of Toast. Put Toast in the worst imaginable situations. Toast finds themselves in Saw, and they're terrified, but they find out that like none of the traps work on them because they're bread, you know, or like, or Toast is in, I don't know, Five Nights at Freddy's, and Fredbear tries to bite him, and then a chunk of toast comes off, and then Toast is just running with the bite taken out of him, and everyone's like, huh? How are they still moving? As far as Toast as a character, 3 foot tall? No, I'm kidding. Could you imagine? No, Toast is like 5 inches tall, canonically. And they go by they, them, because they're a piece of toast. But they also are fine with little guy, because they do embody like that, oh, you're such a little guy energy. And no matter how much damage Toast takes, they feel no pain. And when they take a nap, they wake up perfectly fine. That's all I kind of thought about Toast so far. Oh, and for comedic effect, they can pull out a massive hammer to hit things with, but it doesn't actually like, it's not gonna really hurt anything. Toast is like 6 inches tall. And yeah, I guess that's the character. But speaking of, I kind of rambled there. To commemorate turning this page and getting this official character to be the mascot of the channel, I worked with Makeship for the first time ever, and we're making a plushie, and I finally have concept art. I kind of misunderstood, and I thought Makeship was going to make the concept art for the pledge, and that's not how it works. So I commissioned Barbadroid, as I always do, to make this piece of art for the concept for the plushie. This is not the final design. Makeship hasn't even started working on the design, but this is kind of what we talked is possible and likely for the plushie to look like. And I think this is fucking adorable. So if you want something that's kind of gonna look like this, I'll put the link in the card if I remember, and it'll be top of the description. You cannot buy this plushie yet. You cannot even pledge to buy this plushie yet. The way Makeship works is for 10 days they have a pledge where you can deposit $2 and essentially say you're going to buy this plushie. And if we can get 200 people to do that, then over the course of the next 3 months, Makeship and I will go back and forth on designs and prototypes until we get a plushie that everybody likes, that is honoring the original concept piece for this. And then, I believe like December-ish, like early December, after the 3 months go up, the plushie will be available for pre-order for anyone who did not already pledge. And the people who did pledge those $2 are then charged the remaining amount, and they are put into the pre-order. And that pre-order session is live for 3 weeks, and then they make the plushies and ship them out. Genuinely, I don't know if we're going to hit the 200 mark. I really hope we do, because I really want this little guy. But the U2s, I think in total for U2s, it sold about 106 units, which was really good for our first time ever plushie. Not to mention, I didn't promote the plushie as much as I should have. And part of the reason I didn't is because that I was literally moving that week. Remember that story? As not all of you will know this, but late last year, we had to move out from our apartment. The reason I'm in this basement, right? We had to move out of our apartment because the floorboards were coming up and the landlord was not fixing it, and we have young children. So we moved into a new house, and that house that we moved into had a cockroach infestation that was going to take 2 months to fix. So in 1 week, we moved all of our things 30 minutes away, and then immediately moved all of our things 30 minutes back into a storage unit and crashed at my wife's family's house, and we've been kind of living there ever since to get things resettled and restructured and get a new place. That week was the week the U2s was available to purchase, so I did not promote it as much as I should have, and that's my fault. But I was busy, so I'm gonna be promoting the hell out of this makeshift plushie, and I really hope that we can hit the 200. But I mean, look, if we don't hit the 200. That's fine. We'll try again next time. But I am hopeful that we hit it. That being said, the website is live right now, and you can put in your email address, and it'll essentially alert you when the pledge is live. The pledge goes live at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time this Friday, August 30th. I'll be streaming the minute it goes live. And I'll be promoting the hell out of it and being annoying. So get ready for that. But yeah, anyway, that aside, let's go over some questions, because I talked about that for, holy shit, did I fucking essentially advertise for 10 minutes? Why do y'all put up with me? Anyway, questions. Our first, if you want a question answered in the podcast, send it to Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com. That's in the description. You can copy and paste it because it's pain to type. Our first question comes from Gigi, she, her. My question is, if TalesGames became true, would you rather them be in different locations or one constantly renovated Pizzaplex? To me, the former makes more sense, as the Chuck E. Cheese franchise had a similar thing, with different locations having different casts and themes. Thank you for your question. I'm of two minds, because Tales of the Pizzaplex does directly state multiple times that the Pizzaplex is constantly changing and constantly renovating. So that is reason enough to believe it's all taking place in the same Pizzaplex. However, it is also stated that this is not the only Pizzaplex. There are multiple Freddy Fazbear mega Pizzaplexes throughout the US. So both are possible. My hesitation would be anything that is the direct result of the Mimic 1 program, because not all of them are. Like, I would argue Animatronic Apocalypse, weird fucking story, but not necessarily connected to the Mimic. It might be, but not necessarily. So that could take place at a different Pizzaplex. But something like Nexi, which is the direct result of the storyteller, aka the Mimic 1 program, fucking up, Nexi pretty much has to be in the main Pizzaplex, because that's where the Mimic 1 program is. So that would be my shorthand. If the Mimic 1 program caused this, it is within the same Pizzaplex. If not, it's probably in a different one. It could be in the same one, but it can be in a different one. That would be my shorthand. Kind of similar, if you think about it, to Fazbear Frights, where some stories are directly connected to the epilogues and some aren't. I would say it's less drastic, because those Tales games that aren't directly connected, I don't say are necessarily non-canon or not in continuity. They just don't take place in our Pizzaplex. That would be my guess. But it could go either way. Regardless, thank you for your question, Gigi. Our next question comes from Vic, he, they. How can Into the Pit and the Pizzaplex coexist? How can a franchise get so big and be completely unknown at the same time? Do you think they were through their own version of the Dark Ages and came out joking like it never happened? It feels like quite a stretch of time must have happened between Into the Pit and Security Breach, but that is again another coffee stain on the timeline. First of all, I love the metaphor of that is another coffee stain in the timeline. That I'm going to use that as a turn of phrase. I'm stealing that. That's good as shit. But you kind of hit the nail on the head already in your question. In Tales from the Pizzaplex, we kind of get an answer for this. The chairman of the board is Mr. Burrows, who is a know-it-all rich kid who's very business savvy, and his goal was to be rich. His lifetime goal was just to be rich. Find some beat-up company with a lot of potential, monetize the hell out of it, make a buck, and sell it, and retire. That was his life's goal. And Fazbear became that company. So that is kind of your explanation, right? After Ultimate Custom Night, Fazbear is a disgraced company, nobody talks about it anymore, and there's no active restaurants. And that is kind of where Into the Pit and most of the Fazbear Frights stories take place. Some of the Fazbear Frights stories take place in an active Freddy Fazbear's. That is true, but they're not very good ones. Regardless, a lot of the Fazbear Frights stories take place in this world where Fazbear is like a relic, and people are breaking into old abandoned pizzerias. That is, I believe, probably the mid-2000s to like the early 2020s of the FNAF timeline, where Fazbear is like, oh man, you remember Fazbear? What a place. That's it. And then introducing Mr. Burrows, who sees Fazbear and sees this company who has these characters people loved, but was terribly mismanaged and had a lot of tragedy. And very cynically, he goes, this is a company with a lot of potential and only to go but up. He buys it, monetizes the hell out of it, and within a span of time, we have the Freddy Fazbear Mega Pizzaplex. I think that's the most likely outcome, and it's pretty close to what is directly stated. So that, in my opinion, would be how they coexist. Thank you for your question. Our next question comes from William, him. Do you think we'll ever see Old Man Consequences in the FNAF movie? I think that it could be sort of cool if Mike came across some kind of strange person who gave Mike either vital information or generally good advice. At first I wanted to say no, because Old Man Consequences kind of just exists in this very specific ethereal state of the Fazbear universe. But at the same time, Mike does a lot of weird dream shenanigans. So I would say if we ever see Old Man Consequences, it would be in something like that, where Mike is doing some weird dream shenanigans and he wakes up and meets Old Man Consequences. That being said, I don't think it's going to happen. It'd be cool. I'm generally against that actually being a thing, but who knows? We'll see. I'll tell you what's more likely is we get an Easter egg, either a kid's drawing that looks like Old Man Consequences or legitimately like a dude fishing by a lake with a weird hat that makes him look like Old Man Consequences. I think those are much more likely, but who knows? We'll see. I really have no idea what we're going to get in these FNAF movies. I'm just excited for them. Thank you for your question, though, William. We're kind of speeding through these, but they're pretty straightforward questions. It's from C Tree. She, her. Could the tragedy at Fallfest, assuming it is the inciting incident for the rest of the franchise, be that William not only caused the Fallfest fire, but in doing so, killed the hypothetical gameverse Sammy Emily? Could have even been a cowardice instead of malice. William could have just left him behind despite having the opportunity to save him, just because he was looking out for himself. This could be a way to square a wound first inflicted on me with the supposed death order in Help Wanted 2 having Charlie last. Great question. On the face of it, I hesitate for adding Sammy Emily into the game's timeline, because Sammy Emily, for those of you who don't know, is Henry's son, who in the Silver Eyes, after Charlie's death, he ignores his wife and his son so much in his mania that his wife leaves with his son, leaving Henry to just be alone and crazy. Which, valid. Henry, you have a daughter. Love her. I know you lost her. It's hard. Don't forget that you have a son. Regardless, I could see that being the case. We have no at all, absolute zilch, zero evidence of Sammy Emily existing in the game's timeline at all. But if he were to exist and be killed this early by William's cowardice or neglect, that would slot in pretty well for a lot of places. Like you said, a wound first inflicted on me, the Fallfest fire. and some kind of inciting incident. It's about as good as any other theory that relies on what we have and logic rather than evidence. So I don't think that's going to happen, but it's completely plausible. And hey, if it does, you were right. But thank you for your question. Once again, if you want, this was, I think I answered questions for less time than I advertised. So I guess sorry. But if you have any questions you want answered on the podcast, you can send them into Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com. Once again, that is in the description to copy and paste because it's a pain to type out. But in the meantime, thank you for watching the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast, where the pizza abilities are endless. We hope to enjoy your future patronage. Bye-bye for now.